Hello, this is week 4, video 1 on social structure and organization. So let's begin with some basic premises. First of all, humans are social creatures. They are dependent on one another, and they are embedded in a social structure because of these two premises. So let's look at what a social structure is. First, we can say that a social structure involves status, or actually statuses for individuals. One individual can hold multiple statuses. So a status is a publicly recognized social position within this social structure. It's associated with a corresponding role, a bundle of rights and obligations appropriate for occupants of a particular status. So think of a status that you hold in society. As being publicly recognized, and then think about the rights and obligations that come with that status. Let's say the status of college student, the status of son or daughter. Think about that for yourself, and we can talk about that more during our live class on Thursday. Now, a status can be ascribed or achieved. Ascribed means that status is given to you at birth or at some point in your life, and an achieved status is one that you gain or others gain on your behalf over the course of your lifetime. So a social structure basically comprises these different roles and statuses. So we can define a social structure as key enduring social relationships comprising clusters of statuses with complementary roles that then provide a foundation for regularized and patterned social interaction. So you can see from this definition that it sounds a lot like culture, doesn't it? It uses words like patterned, social, it's about relationships. And so there's something kind of patterned and integrated and enduring here. But then you can also imagine that if that structure comprises statuses and roles that can be ascribed or achieved, that there's a lot of movement within that structure among individuals and among these sort of clusters of statuses. So there are some key questions that come up from this definition of social structure, questions that we've actually asked before during these weeks we've been together. So first of all, to what extent does a social structure endure over time? And to what extent does it change? And change gets to agency, an issue we've discussed. So to what extent does an individual or a group, we could say, have agency within a social structure? So what's the balance between the structure enduring and the structure being changed through negotiation of these statuses and roles? And then finally, a key question for the discussion we're going to be having now about social inequality is, to what extent is inequality structured, which we could say is ascribed, versus the result of individual agency, what is achieved? And then we could also follow that up by asking, to what extent are solutions to social inequality, or to what extent do solutions to social inequality have to address what is structured versus what is the result of individual agency? And these questions will come up in a big way in the Holmes book that you'll be reading, or that hopefully you've already started reading. So early anthropologists, not early, I'd say like mid-20th century, really started to look at how certain kinds of political and social organizations start to embed inequality and hierarchy in them. And we call this the band, tribe, chiefdom, state configuration. It's a little out of date now because, as always, when we sort of categorize lots of different human groups into a few categories, over time we start to see that those categories don't apply well because there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of complexity that always doesn't necessarily fit in these categories. But let's go through this together, and we'll see how much it seems to have some quote-unquote truth in it, and to what extent we need, based on knowledge you've gained in this class, we need to kind of take it with a grain of salt. So look at this with me and think about some of the examples we've had. So first of all, under socio-political type, we start with the band. Now, you've seen bands before if you read the Junhuanzi article about foragers. Foragers tend to live in bands, small groups of people, small, flexible groups of people. So we see band, and then to the right of that, foraging. That's the economic type associated with this organization. And examples, Inuit and San. San is the old name for the Junhuanzi, so we see they fall into this classification. Inuit is the contemporary name for what used to be called Eskimos, so you've learned a little bit about them as well through the work of Franz Boas. Now look to the right of that. Type of regulation, local. Remember, even those of you who didn't read the article, remember how the Junhuanzi sort of regulated their life and their political, social, and economic relationships. They did it within the band itself or within a group of bands. So, for example, if there was conflict within a band, then the two people in conflict with each other just kind of separated and went off to join other bands. And that was about it. They didn't have any kind of leader or adjudicator or mediator of conflict. They didn't have a specific person who, decided when they were going to move to the next watering hole or anything like that. They sort of just solved all of their problems and came up with all of their plans just locally within the band in a very informal way. Now look at the next line, socio-political type, tribe. This is associated with the horticulture or pastoralism economic type. Okay, small-scale agriculture. And that is illustrated in our reading by the Nur of South Sudan. So remember, they weren't very easily classified as either horticulturalists or pastoralists. They mainly relied on cattle, but they also grew some crops, they fished, they did a little hunting and gathering. So, the Nur, look over to the right under type of regulation. They also had local regulation. They sort of solved their problems within their own group. But then there were also like temporary regional aspects. So remember the figure of the leopard skin chief who was called upon to solve conflicts such as murders between Nur men. So remember the leopard skin chief was not an elected office. It wasn't a permanent institution. He was simply a man from another village who was called in to mediate a conflict, that particular conflict, and then he was finished. The next conflict might be solved by another leopard skin chief who was chosen, again, locally and temporarily. So this is the kind of regulation we see at the tribal level. When we move up a step in complexity to a chiefdom, this is when we get to the economic type of productive horticulture, pastoral nomadism, not the kind of very local nomadism of the Nur, kind of moving from low ground to high ground, but more nomadic peoples who move over hundreds or thousands of square miles over the course of a year or a number of years. The chiefdom is typical of most Native American groups in North America, so you see Cherokee there as one of the examples, and we might see a little bit about the chiefdom way of life in the Deloria reading that we did about Native American groups being like corporations. So we see here permanent. This is a new word under type of regulation, permanent regional regulation. So now we start to see institutionalized offices of regulators. So, for example, the chief is a position that's held by an individual and then probably passed down to his son or his brother or another person who's chosen by the tribe. A step up in complexity to that is the state. And that's the fourth under sociopolitical type. We really don't see states develop. States are old. We've had states in the human record for 10,000 years or so. They coincide with the rise of agriculture, settled agriculture, and then are certainly characteristic of industrialism. So you see ancient Mesopotamia, again, states are old, and then the contemporary United States and Canada. And here the type of regulation is permanent and regional, but a step up in complexity from the chiefdom. So let's look at chiefdoms and states and see what they can tell us about where hierarchy and stratification, which is another word for social inequality, sort of come into being. So in terms of political structures, again, bands and tribes, local and temporary. At the chiefdom and state level, we start to see some permanency. But notice that chiefdoms are largely, their political structure is largely based on kinship, whereas in states, they are not based on kinship. Now we might have Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. as president, but generally speaking, presidents in the United States are elected. So that's not a system that's based on kinship. But in chiefdoms, it is. And remember when we talked about family, excuse me, and kinship, we talked about how, excuse me, had to take a little break there. Anyway, recall when we talked about family and kinship and why anthropologists devoted so much time to the study of kinship and those kinship charts. One of the things we talked about was how kinship structure can tell us something about political structure as well. So we see that clearly at the level of the chiefdom. When it comes to access to resources, we see again bands and tribes are pretty egalitarian. So for example, among the Junhuanzi, there's no real inequality between generations or between men and women because everyone is so highly interdependent, and again because there's little property to fight over. So we see societies at this level illustrating egalitarian social relationships. But at the level of chiefdoms and states, we begin to see stratification. So in chiefdoms, that stratification is largely based on kinship. So the chief and his family and families associated with those families tend to have a higher status and maybe a different set of roles and different access to resources compared with people who are not part of the families in power and related to the chief. In states, those access to resources are generally speaking not based on kinship. And we'll be talking about other things that they can be based on.